The Global Child Protection Working Group, the international coordinating body for protecting girls and boys in humanitarian settings, has produced a video series on the minimum standards for child protection in humanitarian action. These minimum standards, also known as the CPMS, were developed through widespread interagency collaboration. They are one of the companions to the Sphere standards. This video examines Standard 12, the worst forms of child labor. For other installments in the series, please go to the CPWG's website.
A humanitarian crisis will enhance the risk of children being involved in the worst forms of child labor. It will also increase the vulnerability of families. They won't be able anymore to provide basic food, subsistence, education will be cut also. There will be no employment. They will find themselves into a very highly vulnerable situation. The only possibility will be to send their children to work.
The CPMS have been established to make these children visible to humanitarian workers and to ensure that our programming meets their needs. Their 10 guiding principles must be the basis of our efforts.
I think the minimum standards are possibly the single most important development in emergency and in development in recent years.
The standard articulates that girls and boys are protected from the worst forms of child labor, in particular those related to or made worse by the emergency. The worst forms of child labor include forced labor, trafficking for exploitation, illicit activities, sexual exploitation, and other hazardous work that harms children's health, safety, and morals. So to unpack all that, let's imagine two children who live with their parents on a small farm near a town. Mariam is 13 and her brother Rollo is 16. The family has always been poor, selling the fruits and vegetables they grow. Rollo attends secondary school with the support of a national program. He also helps the family after school and at weekends. Mariam works all day in the home and farm. After an emergency hit their town, their crops were destroyed and their parents no longer able to work. Global experience shows that a humanitarian crisis will most likely impact pre-existing levels of child labor, increasing the scale and severity of the work children do.
I think because of the devastation of Yolanda, it has brought negative changes. They are still young to be in a store or become a bagger boy or plastic guy and helping in the restaurants. There is remarkably increased number of child below 18 who are really working.
Injured during the emergency and with little income, Mariam and Rollo's parents had no alternative but to send their daughter to live with distant relatives. The extended family also struggled to provide for her and made her work as domestic help for their neighbor, where she was abused and worked long hours. Meanwhile, Rollo could no longer go to school as it had been destroyed, and since his family could not afford to send him to a school further away, he found work at a local construction site. Even though he was older than 15, in this country, the minimum age for employment, he faced many hazards there. As this family's dilemma demonstrates, there may be a continuum of child labor which can be accelerated by emergencies. Children who are already working are more at risk of moving into the worst forms, and once in the worst forms, moving back into education proves extremely difficult.
But with the current conflicts, most of the simple livelihoods which had been built slowly were destroyed. So children have resorted to the worst forms of child labor. You see that children are coming from one level of labor into another one, which is worse than the one before. The ones who are already in the conflict, who are already working, have descended into child prostitution. Kids from the new conflict who have been displaced have resorted to commercial sex work for survival.
So prioritize the worst forms of child labor, starting with those related to or made worse by the emergency. Be sure to consider local forms of hazardous work, which often affect at-risk adolescents, such as Rollo's situation. This can seem a challenging task. Here is how one organization in South Sudan tackled it.
It is a huge issue and a very complex issue that we need to prioritize our actions, look at what are the pre-existing worst form of child labor before the emergencies, so to get an overview of the situation. And then we also need to analyze how the emergencies had an impact. We also need to analyze if we do not respond to a particular worst form of child labor, what will be the impact on children. If those impacts are life-threatening one, then we should definitely consider to prioritize in our first phase emergency response. We also need to evaluate our capacity and resources that we can respond to particular worst form of child labor.
In order to address the priority needs, new workers should first understand the context of child labor and the response to eliminate it that was underway prior to the crisis. This may include the Ministry of Labor, national steering committees that coordinate the response, local NGOs, and existing referral pathways.
They should also look at what the different actors, international actors, are doing and how they can establish synergies. They could also look at the different legislation if there is a hazardous list, for example, or if there is a minimum age, and start from there, not start from scratch.
For those of us already addressing the issue, an emergency can be an overwhelming experience where our usual ways of working are challenged. However, they can present opportunities to strengthen and grow existing projects and networks to address child labor. In order to do this, you need to map and coordinate with the existing and emerging services.
In Jordan, we already had a national child labour referral mechanism, and it addressed the very clear roles and responsibilities of the different national actors. However, alongside of that, we then also had the child protection referral pathways of the humanitarian response. So we needed to ensure that there was that coherence, that integration, and those communication mechanisms between the two pathways.
That is really important, that the whole sectors are worked hands in hands and also working through existing structure and systems instead of creating a whole new systems, which is not very feasible in an emergency situation.
Let's go back to Rollo. An NGO working on economic recovery assessed his workplace as hazardous and referred him to a local child-friendly space for follow-up. To help Rollo, a case manager contacted the program that had been supporting his education. This highlights the importance of emergency and non-emergency actors collaborating to understand changes and address new forms of child labor. It also points to the need to capitalize on existing efforts and supporting his education. Since there are many reasons why children work, we should collaborate with other sectors to ensure a comprehensive and integrated response. Measures aimed at sustaining livelihoods and access to quality, formal or informal education are key elements for success.
Therefore, it's very important that we do mainstream the issue of child labour across our service provision, whether that be social services, accommodation, education, food provision. It doesn't matter. It's important that we take into account that there are working children involved, and we need to target them specifically because they have very specific needs and expectations. Not to necessarily say that there has to be a dedicated response every time, but simply by making people more aware, by ensuring that there are human and financial and knowledge resources which are being directed towards the problem, we can begin to address some of these issues.
The reason why children are trafficked or they come to work is because there is no livelihood at home, or they have been separated from their families, or they are very, very poor and they are not going to school. So you cannot address the issues of child labor without providing alternatives. There should be some form of livelihood support or even immediate food aid. Their education should be taken into consideration. You should monitor their health.
As part of your programming, ensure the ongoing and systematic collection of data. Coordinate with other actors. take opportunities across sectors, and focus on severity and scale. Without this evidence, it is impossible to persuade donors, governments, or other humanitarian actors that child labor has been impacted by the emergency and can be life-threatening.
If you see, there are no existing data comprehensive data on child labor. And that was one of the biggest challenges we had. We had conducted the assessment on the child protection and education joint assessment, and that gave a lot of information about situation of children. Then there was an anecdotal information available which we tried to gather from the NGOs. This indicated where are the hotspots which should monitor.
Rolo and Mariam's family were fortunate. In this crisis, the local CPWG did an assessment which identified child labor as a core issue. Evidence from the assessment helped secure funding for awareness-raising workshops for other sectors, as well as some targeted support. Their parents are now part of an economic strengthening project, and their community is rebuilding the local secondary school. Thanks to their new situation, Mariam will be returning to her family. All over the world, child protection actors report that the CPMS's inclusion of the worst forms of child labor helps to convince donors and other stakeholders of the importance of the issue. It has provided us with a strong platform to engage in emergency response planning, to build an evidence base and to fundraise, as well as provided a practical tool for project design and implementation. The minimum standard on the worst forms of child labor takes our work to a whole new level. Other installments in this series focus on how to use the CPMS and on the specific standards for addressing needs. The CPWG provides support for applying the standards, such as mainstreaming briefs, guidance on contextual adaptation, and training packages. For more information, please go to cpwg.net/minimum-standards.